again. So we have talked about Uranus. We have talked about Uranus, which is all things new, inventive, change-based, revolution-based, progressive, erratic, surprising, shocking sometimes. We've also talked about Neptune, which represents all things that take us away from where we are for good in terms of healing or romance or inspiration, or bad in terms of addiction or vulnerability. So let's talk about Pluto. Pluto is a planet, by the way. There was a bit of a hoo-ha there for a few years where it was believed that Pluto was not a planet, but he has been reinstated as of 2017 or 2016, I believe. He should never be underestimated, so it makes me laugh because astrologers would never underestimate Pluto, but astronomers did underestimate Pluto for a wee while there. Based on his size as a planet, he was kind of downgraded to a very large asteroid before astronomers, I guess, realized that the power of Pluto is what defines him as a planet, not his size. But as astrologers, we knew that already. So it's one of those times where astronomy had to catch up to astrology. In mythology, Pluto represents Hades, who is the god of the underworld, and this is what Pluto represents to us in our natal chart, and also on a social level. So it represents the underworld, it represents the things we don't want to look at. But those are the things that give us the most power. So Pluto is a power planet. In the natal chart, it represents where we are challenged, where we experience conflict, where there may be a death and rebirth, and not physically someone being hit by a bus, but in the sense of wherever Pluto is in your chart, at some point there will be a breaking down of an old way of thinking or existing, which might feel, like a dark night of the soul, because it's something that has been so familiar to you for so long, and all of a sudden it crumbles and you have to really rebuild from the ground up. Pluto also represents the phoenix. So when I talk about death and rebirth, I talk about in terms of the phoenix. I'm talking about the actual rebirth part. I'm not talking about anyone dying or anything like this. But of course it can represent conflict and difficulty, because it's the planet that will force us into change, because it's an area that generally we don't want to deal with. We don't want to have conflict there, so it will be forced upon us until we claim our power. So if we look at the mythology of Hades and Persephone in mythology, Hades was blamed for the rape of Persephone, but the traditional mythology was that Persephone, who was this goddess of the springtime, she fell in love with Hades. But I guess the mythology's changed over time, because the concept that a woman could fall in love with this underworld powerful being is so strange, but we know that's obviously not the case. And not only did Persephone go down to the underworld because she loved him so much, she re-emerged for 6 months of every year as queen of the underworld. So she existed on Earth as queen of the underworld. And that's kind of the lesson of Pluto. It's like, if you go in and you claim your power in that sense. So initially, especially in early life, Pluto can show us where we have been most disempowered, or where we experience conflict, where we experience things out of our control. It also shows us things, Neptune and Pluto in particular, shows us where things are out of our control, in order to make us appreciate the control and the influence that we do have. So where you give your power away will generally be shown by Neptune and Pluto. A lot of, I guess, traditional astrologers would say that Pluto is like a bad planet, or it's a dark planet, or a difficult planet, or whatever. So beware if you Google, but it's really not that terrible. But it is really important life lessons. And this is the thing, though. Everyone will experience Pluto in some form in their lifetimes. None of us escape it, but it's how we deal with that experience, whether we let it completely break us, or whether we delve deep into authenticity and we re-emerge as queen of the underworld, as the as someone who is proud of their experiences. So a lot of people who have Moon Pluto aspects, Sun Pluto aspects, especially Mars Pluto aspects, have had, breakdowns in some way or another around their identity. A lot of people with a Moon Pluto aspect have had a breakdown in the relationship with their mother or with their parents in some way. Also potentially around pregnancy as well. Moon Pluto aspects can talk about miscarriage or termination or difficulty around conceiving in some way. Things that break your heart and break you open. Mars and Pluto aspects are ones to look out for in the chart because they can talk about the potential for aggression or for accidents. So again, I'm not trying to be a scary astrologer. I'm talking about Pluto, but if you do have a Mars, say Mars square Pluto, Mars opposition Pluto, it's a lesson for you because again, Mars is about what you do, it's about your energy, and Pluto is about control. So it's one of those things where you need to take, not in an obsessive way, but where you need to take a lot of responsibility for yourself if you have an aspect like that, because you could be on the receiving end of someone more dominant who doesn't necessarily have your best interest at heart. So for instance, I have Mars opposition Pluto. I have been in 5 car accidents in my lifetime, none of which I was at fault. So only 2 of the times I was driving, and both of those times I was technically driving, but I was actually parked. So I was, stopped at a red light. I was hit by an angry van driver behind me, doing 1,000,000 miles an hour. We both nearly killed about 400 people when he did that. So that would be traditionally an aspect we would go, okay, that has potential for accidents or this or that. But one thing, if I get into a car, especially if it's a car driven by a male, I'm really pedantic about seatbelts on, are you doing the speed limit? I've always been pedantic about, drink driving because I lost a lot of friends. I lost a lot of people that I knew when I was in high school to drink driving, or to drug driving, or to any of those sorts of things. So Pluto makes you very aware of mortality in some sense. And so if you have in particular a Mars-Pluto aspect in your chart, it's where you have to take responsibility for keeping yourself safe as much as you can. And so in that case, for instance, when I was a teenager, because obviously, I was introduced quite early to astrology, I would very rarely drink when I went out because I would prefer to be the person driving home than the person trusting someone else to drive me home. And even now, I'm not a big fan of having other people drive me around because if I drive, I know I'm going to be safe because I'm taking responsibility for it in that sense. So for you, Pluto in your natal chart is where you need to be authentic, not where you need to be afraid. It's not predicting that anything horrific is going to happen. But there will be wake-up calls throughout your life, and we all have Pluto, so obviously everyone will experience this. But it was where you will have experiences through your life reminding you to stay authentic, to stay in your power, and don't give your power away to someone. So, for example, people with Pluto in the... Let's talk about Pluto in the 11th house. There are a lot of people with Pluto in the 11th house who end up involved in maybe cults, or who end up in really negative friend groups, or who end up in perhaps going along with things that they didn't realize at the time. Because, Pluto at the 11th house represents, friends, our organizations, that type of thing. So, a lot of organizations where there's perhaps embezzling going on, or there's some kind of theft, or, charities, for example. The 11th house rules charities. So a lot of Pluto in the 11th house have been involved in some way in a charity that was embezzling, or that wasn't contributing the money it should have been, or it was a front for something else. And it wasn't their fault, but it's one of those things that if you don't take your power and you don't know what exactly is going on, you will kind of be implicated. So if you have Pluto in the third house, you have to at all times make sure you're communicating exactly what it is that you need. Because if someone takes the wrong idea, you'll get wake up calls around that. So Pluto in your natal chart is where you have to really, really be authentic. You have to do the work. You have to do research. You have to take responsibility. Because Pluto will destroy anything that's not real. And that's kind of why I love Pluto. Pluto will destroy anything that's not real. So it's part of our lesson as people that only the authentic stuff can survive. And we all know someone who has, a life that's a wonderful facade. And at some point, it always hits a wall. It always falls apart. And that is Pluto. Or a Pluto transit. I had Pluto across my sun for a couple of years. And that was when I moved overseas. And that's when I really was open about things that had happened to me, not just in my life, but also the spiritual things that I practice and everything. Because I got to a point where I was sick of compartmentalizing all of my different lives, my spiritual life, from my corporate life to my study life to my writing to my personal life. It was all very compartmentalized. My whole life I tried to keep it all very, very separate. And then when my Pluto Sun transit began, when I was maybe 20, I had a stalker for a few months. I had to get a restraining order. But part of that court process was I had no proof that person was stalking me, because I never told anyone, because I gave my power away. And so it became very, very hard to prove, even though this person had shot at my house, had threatened to kill me, had to do all these things, because I kept all parts of my life so separate, because I didn't want my work people to know I was spiritual. I didn't want spiritual people to know that I was, that I had this very violent stalker. It was all these sorts of things. But that was a perfect example of a very severe, I suppose, Pluto Sun transit, because my entire identity changed. Once I went through that, I realized that for my own safety, every part of my life has to be cohesive, because I would never again want to be in a position where I was in physical danger of some kind and no one knew where I was, or no one knew what I was doing, or people were unsure about things. So, that's a very extreme example. You're not all going to have stalkers, but my guides don't mind my lessons being intense for the purposes of teaching, I suppose. But yeah, so that's a very extreme example, but it shows that with Pluto, where you give your power away, like I did, by separating all parts of my life and kind of being ashamed, of different aspects of my life that weren't perfect, it actually damaged me in the end. Whereas if I had just been open from the start, I would have got through the court process in half the time, because I would have had 10 people I could have called on that said, yes, actually she told me about this and that this happened and I was there when this happened, or whatever thing. And so for you, in your natal chart, look at the house that your Pluto is in, and that is an area of your life where you need to be transparent, you need to be authentic, you need to own your power in some way. So we'll talk about this when we have the wee Skype sessions in a couple of weeks. We will talk more about this, about Pluto in your chart, because Pluto is also where you get your most power. Pluto is also where you are the queen of something or the king of something. It is where you are the strongest, where you can influence the most. It's where you can destroy something and rebuild it. And as an example, I went through this court process with the person that had been stalking me, and it was horrific. It was absolutely horrific and traumatizing, and I was 20 and, had no support and the whole bloody thing. However, part of the judgment, I suppose, when I got the restraining order, was that the person who had done it was no longer allowed to own a gun. And in doing that, and then they showed me afterwards his record of abusing women, threatening women with guns, all that type of thing. And he worked in the police, so he had to use a gun. But by me stepping into my power and pursuing that, his gun license was taken away. He wasn't allowed access to a gun. And so we can therefore assume that this person who was dangerous and had access to guns now no longer does. So I walked away with my freedom, but there's also some woman out there who, as a result of me stepping into my power, is not a victim of that person. So again, this is a very extreme example, but it's a very good example because it shows you when you step into your power, you have massive ability to change something for future generations, for your kids, for other women, for society that you don't realize. And this is where we start getting into the generational lesson, because your generational lesson, as with Pluto, is what part of society or humanity is being destroyed and rebuilt in a better, more authentic way. So for the majority of us on this course, we would be Pluto in Virgo through till Pluto in Scorpio, I think, age-wise. I'll have to check your charts, but I was born into Pluto in Scorpio. So if you were, 80s, 90s, you're probably Pluto in Scorpio, Pluto in Sagittarius before that, after that rather, and then Pluto in Virgo beforehand. So Pluto in Scorpio is the generation that in the last, say, 10 years has been active behind, Pluto obviously represents sex amongst other things, and truth and identity and power and all those types of things. So if we look at the change in marriage equality, in terms of gay rights, in terms of gender awareness, in terms of sexual equality, those have all been major political issues at the forefront of society in the last 10 years. So as soon as the Pluto and Scorpio generation grew up and started having influence, those Scorpio issues have been dismantled and rebuilt in healthier ways, which is we do have marriage equality in a lot of countries. We are kind of campaigning for more rights for rape victims. There are more, there's more visibility around different genders, that kind of thing. All of that has been a result of the work of the Pluto and Scorpio generation, for example. On my website, I actually have if you go over to the blog and you search Pluto, there's actually an in-depth article on Pluto through the different generations, which I would really recommend you to read. But yeah, as a generation, it shows what in society we're dismantling. So if you're having what feels like a Plutonic experience, look at the sign that your Pluto is in, because that will show you where your experience is feeding a bigger part of society and where you are actually making a contribution to overhauling some very outdated, inauthentic part of society that needs updating. So again, Pluto is not just about our experiences, it's about our experiences that have impact on a massive, massive humanitarian level. It also represents where we're doing karmic healing as well, so much like Saturn. So for example, again, the court process and me getting restraining, all that sort of thing, it also was the first time a woman in my family, and all the women in my family for like the last probably 1,000 years, had been victims of male violence. And it was the first time that any single woman in my family had pursued someone and called to account a male for violence. So it wasn't just about me, it was also about affirming that all the women that had come before me that experienced abuse, it was also for them. It was also for my daughter to know that that will never be acceptable. And so that I can say to her, that was never acceptable, and I did everything in my power to ensure that that behavior is not acceptable going further than me. So wherever you have Pluto difficulty in your life, know that how you deal with it has massive healing ramifications, and that's why it can often feel so serious. Why Pluto lessons can feel so serious, because you're doing a lot of collective healing. It's not just about, you having a personal experience, is that you're having a collective experience. So whatever you heal, wherever you step into your power, you change for massive amounts of people. So if you ever want to look at meaning in your own life, and why you're here and having a meaningful life and your legacy, look at your Pluto as well, because it'll show you difficulty, but it'll show you where you have the most influence to change people's lives just through stepping into your own power in your own life. So, Pluto. Power imbalances or power in general, authenticity, rebirth, the phoenix, transformation, past and future healing, rehauling on a social level. So they're all the Pluto lessons. So that is Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. I know all these videos are quite long today, but these planets are quite complex. So we had to talk about a few other social things in order to give you a stronger idea of how they feed in. So on a personal level, you can look mainly at your personal planets, but then once you start getting into bigger philosophical issues of why am